And I would like to introduce on stage my favorite journalist from Europe, Robin Wauters from Tech.eu. Please, some applause. And
thanks.
And Robin has some really, really cool stuff to share with us. I'm so happy to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's so great to see you again. And like we've been sharing some stages on the Next Web at some point. Infogram
we're getting old.
Was like Infogram was a young startup. We both were young, and we were like sharing some stages there. So really happy to have you here. And you're gonna tell about the Baltics.
Yes, yeah, I'm gonna present a report.
So you think Baltics is cool?
Yeah, I think the Baltics are cool for many, many reasons, and startups included.
Do you think we're doing good? Do you think we're doing okay?
That's what I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
In general, yes.
Okay.
But there's always a but.
Okay. Big applause to Robin, and let's listen to what's in for the Baltics.
Thank you. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name's Robin. I'm Belgian. I'm a tech journalist. I've been doing this for about 12 years now. And as Peter mentioned in the previous presentation, I used to work at TechCrunch writing about global innovation and startups from all over the place, mostly Silicon Valley back then when I started. But over the past few years, I've kind of taken an interest in seeing how the European startup ecosystems, because there's many of them combined into one, how they're doing, and how they're doing similar or relative to other ecosystems, how they're growing, what stage are they in, how are they similar, how do they differ. What do they need? What are some of the policies that governments are implementing to encourage entrepreneurs? Because obviously it's a very fragmented region. And you cannot cover Europe just by sitting on your couch. So I travel a lot to all of these places. And I gather a lot of, well, our team gathers a lot of data on funding, M&A transactions, government policies that are being implemented. And this is all to make sense of what's happening here, but also what's not happening here. And I'm very excited that we partnered with Digital Freedom Festival to launch a report on the Baltics, which is one of my favorite regions here in Europe, and obviously a very active one when it comes to technology innovation. So this is sort of what we do. We're kind of an online media company. We do a podcast, a newsletter, we do news, but our core activity, our core business is research. So we do a lot of data collection, and we also provide insights on top of that data, because data only tells part of that story. And that's actually something that I also wanted to mention before I start showing you all charts and numbers, which may be a little boring, is that there's two things I need to say before we start. One is that nobody's perfect. We cannot possibly think that we can gather all of the funding rounds and all of the M&A transactions. We do try, and I think we are among the best at doing it. And I don't think there's ever been a report as comprehensive about the Baltics as a whole than this one. But the reality is that data can lie. Right? Not everyone agrees on the type of data that we use, on the type of correlations that we make, on the categorization. Some people will still call Bitfury, for example, a Latvian company, while we won't, because we have some criteria that doesn't really fit into that anymore. Some people wouldn't include TransferWise as an Estonian company anymore, but we do, for other reasons. So, it's the story you tell. With data, it differs from time to time. So people sometimes get angry, like, oh, you forgot this round, you forgot this company, or you didn't make this conclusion. And the reality is you can do this for yourself, and you can set your own criteria. But if you want to be consistent, and you want to be able to compare and measure, then you need to set some rules. So this is just our way of looking at the data. Second thing I want to mention is that you can measure things like funding rounds, and how many investments, and how many deals, and how many M&A transactions, how many IPOs. And it's easy to compare in history. And you can sort of sense an evolution there. But an ecosystem is much more than that. It's also about the people, and it's about the culture, and it's about community, and it's about working together and collaborate between countries even to encourage the next generation of entrepreneurs to talk to your governments, both national and European level, and tell them what you want to have implemented for you so you can build bigger companies, so you can build more ambitious businesses. And that, I think, is very important, and it doesn't always, it can't always be captured in charts and numbers. So the reality is that the Baltics, even if the numbers, and I'll show you in a bit, even if the numbers kind of fluctuate, there's no linear growth. I'll show that in a second. I think this is a really, really exciting time across all three Baltic states for entrepreneurs to build tech businesses. These are the key takeaways of the report. It's about almost 460 million euros raised. The period that we measured was 2014 to Q3 2017, because obviously the year is not finished yet. And of course, TransferWise announces a $280 million round just last week or 2 weeks ago. So they're not included in these charts. If they would be, then of course that number would be, it's almost half of the number of total raised so far across the Baltics. So it would make a lot of difference. Top verticals, I don't think that's much of a surprise. Lots of fintech, marketing tech, fashion, robotics, and transportation, which is, of course, due to Taxify as well. Some of the top startups in funding, I'm sure you know these companies. But the interesting thing is that the top startups by funding are not all from the same country. They're not all Estonian. Cream Finance is from here. Vinted is from Lithuania. The investment volume, and keep in mind that 2017, the year is not complete yet, so it'll obviously be a lot higher now that TransferWise round has been announced. But you can see that there is no linear growth there, while in some mature ecosystems, especially France and Germany, this line, both number of deals and investment volume kind of goes neatly up and to the right. The Baltics, it doesn't. It kind of goes like this. And the reason for this is that if you dive into the data, there are lots of rounds. I mean, 360 deals is not nothing. But the reality is that the average round size is very, very small. So it depends on a lot of the big financing rounds for the scaling companies, the scale-ups that really, really make a lot of difference. And that goes up and down. You can't really see any linear growth just yet. But I'm sure we will. As I mentioned, the average round size and the median round size, it's a little bit of a difference, differs a lot from country to country. This is where Latvia really has made a lot of progress. You can see in 2014 to 2016 that the average round size was really, really small, even relative to Estonia and Lithuania. But that's really changed in 2017 for a number of reasons. Doesn't really translate that well when you look at median rounds, but I'm sure that's an evolution. And I think these charts, and give it another 2-3 years, and I think they'll be closer together. But the reality is, in terms of capital, Estonia is really, really far ahead when it comes to average round size. Latvia is a little bit behind. This is a not fair comparison. This is an unfair comparison because I include all European countries and pit them against the Baltic states, so you can see them sort of in the back right there. But of course, that's not fair. And for the simple reason that these are much, much bigger countries. Much higher GDP, and a lot bigger in terms of population. So what we did at Tech.eu is we also looked at the investment per capita, which paints a very different picture. And then the charts look a little bit like this, where you can see that countries like Sweden and Switzerland really, really punch above their weight. Sweden because of Spotify and Klarna and all of these big companies growing up there. And Switzerland because of one really, really big round that changed the numbers completely, as it happens when you do data. But here's the interesting thing. Estonia is outcompeting France and Germany when it comes to investment per capita. Latvia and Lithuania are about the same size, a little bit outperforming even Spain and Italy, which are among the top 5 economies in Europe. So it's either a question of, is Spain and Italy really, really punching below their weight? Are they really not performing well? Or are the Baltic states really outperforming them because they're a lot more active? I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. But that's something that you can really take into account if you remember anything of this presentation, is that in terms of per capita funding, Baltic startups are doing really, really well. So this is sort of the same story, but in numbers rather than charts. Estonia scores relatively high, almost as big as the UK when it comes to per capita funding. Imagine that. And bigger than Germany, Netherlands, and Denmark and France, which gets a lot of the visibility and the attention, also from press, including us. But the reality is that we should be looking more at the Baltics, and not just the Baltics, let's be honest. It's also like smaller Eastern European communities. I like to go to places like Lviv in Ukraine or to Chisinau in Moldova and to kind of check out what's happening there. Because the reality is, and this is what I said in the beginning, you can't measure everything in numbers. The reality is that there is interesting stuff happening everywhere. It's a bit of a cliche. You can build a great company from anywhere. Look at Prezi in Budapest. But it's really nice to watch. Like if you go to London, it's super mature. If you go to Berlin, it's happening, right? There's lots of big companies, lots of capital. What I like to do is go to these smaller ecosystems, smaller countries, where there still needs to be a lot of, there's a lot of work to be done. But you can see the accelerators coming up, angels forming, closer networks to co-investing companies. You can see more ambitious entrepreneurs. You can see governments implementing policies to encourage entrepreneurship and investment. And this is where not just Latvia, but the Baltic states really, really shine, is that you have governments that are really, really, really active in doing that. Having startup visa programs. These are in all 3 countries that you have one. Estonia has e-residency, as I'm sure you all know. I'm an e-resident, I haven't used it yet, but I am one. And then you have different tax regimes, you have policies that help foreign talent come into the country, either to start their own business or to join existing startups and scale-ups. But that, I think, makes a lot of difference. And it's starting to translate. Foreign capital, a little bit less the case. So it's still coming mostly from local investors, which is also the reason that the round sizes are smaller, is that the VC firms in this region don't really have the capacity to help a company grow beyond Series B and Series C rounds. But that's just a matter of time. Same story, different chart, but it shows you kind of the funding per capita on the map. These are some of the most notable companies. I know that there's a little bit of a debate if EcoBalt is really a tech company. We categorize them as a clean tech company. That may not have been the best decision. But they were among the top startups. You can see that almost 100 million euros worth of funding in Latvia in the period that we analyzed, which is about the same as Lithuania, although they may present different numbers. So the reality is that when you have founders that come from a certain country, whether it be Latvia or Lithuania, and they move their company abroad, they literally say our headquarters are now in London or in San Francisco or New York, which is often the case, then the reaction of the local startup associations is always, well, they're still Latvian and they're still Lithuanian, and we should still count them in the numbers. But you have to draw the line somewhere. TransferWise is a kind of in the gray zone because most of their staff are still in Tallinn. The founders spend a lot of time there. They hire back office, engineering, customer support, still a lot of them in Estonia, so we categorize them as an Estonian company. But that's not always the reality. In fact, what we see in the data is also that if companies start scaling up in the Baltics, very, very oftentimes they will need to move abroad just to scale. And that's a question of capital and talent. And that's not a shame. That's not bad. That's not necessarily a negative thing for the ecosystem. In fact, many of these companies, many of these entrepreneurs, when they're successful, when they exit their companies, when they build the experience that they need to kind of do this again, they will also pass on not just their wealth, but their knowledge and their experience with local ecosystem, which helps them grow. It's a circle. It's a cycle. It doesn't always move in waves, right? So I'm going to get to my conclusion. I promise to keep it very short, because who wants to look at numbers for 20 minutes? But the Baltics really, really punch above their weight, especially when it comes to per capita funding. That's a really, really big, important key takeaway. You have governments that actively support startups. There's always room to complain, but then actually do that. Because I find that, and especially in smaller countries, I find the mentality of entrepreneurs is always to, not always, but sort of to wait for governments to act, and then they say, well, how can we reach them? Like they're sitting in their ivory tower over in the European Commission, whatever. But the reality is they also want to hear from you. So it's very important as national startup associations to band together with others and to kind of like have sort of a European voice for startups and try to get policies implemented, not just on a national level, but on a European level as well. Super important to actually make your voice heard as well. Scaling up locally is still very, very difficult. I don't think that's much of a surprise. This is just a reality when you're a small country. You cannot expect to have the ability for scale-ups to bring in all the talent and the capital that they need in the same way that you would be able to do this in London or New York or San Francisco. So that's just a logical conclusion, I think. Success breeds ecosystems. I mentioned this very briefly, but if you have successful entrepreneurs that move out of the country to build their companies elsewhere and only have like a local staff left for the minority of the company, that doesn't really matter. You want them to be successful to eventually give back to the community, whether it's in terms of experience, knowledge, and I would also encourage you to think about how you can share your experience with your peers, not just in Latvia, but also in other Baltic states. I think it's super important to sort of have that community feeling, because it's much easier to grow together than it is individually. And I think like the data doesn't always show this, but I know this because I travel here regularly and I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs and investors here. I think there's a lot of potential for the Baltics to become a lot bigger and to have these charts go neatly up and to the right in the future. That's about it for me. You can buy this report. It's only £99. You can also subscribe to Tech.eu. It's €100 a year, and then you get one for free. But we posted the takeaways on Tech.eu if you want to reread. And I'd be happy to talk to you the rest of the day. I'm here until Wednesday, so come bother me if you find me in the hallways. Thank you so much for your attention, and good to be here.